Her son slapped a box of crackers from her hands. "Put it back, old witch. You don't have money." Margaret Lane, widow and former accountant, didn't argue. She waited, nodded, and let him pay for his soda and pride. By morning, she'd bought a 2-bedroom in cash, under a name he'd never seen. He thought she was poor. She was simply finished pretending. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The gentle hum of overhead lights blended with the soft classical music piping through the speakers as Maggie Wells guided her wicker-handled cart down the organic section of Asheville's prettiest high-end grocery store. She moved with slow certainty, her knit cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders, eyes scanning the labels not for price, but for purity. Her fingers curled around a box of Fairtrade Earl Grey, the good kind, and placed it into the cart alongside a delicate bundle of fresh rosemary. She paused at the seafood case, her gaze settling on a glistening fillet of wild-caught salmon, perfectly pink. As the young man behind the counter wrapped it with practiced hands, she smiled faintly. "Dinner deserves something beautiful," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Maggie?" The voice was unmistakable. Too loud for a grocery store, too sharp for a family greeting. "Jason." She turned and found him striding toward her, hands shoved into the pockets of a designer zip-up hoodie. He was flanked, as usual, by Tina, his wife, her perfectly glossed lips pursed like she'd smelled something sour. Jason's eyes flicked to the salmon in her cart. "You're still buying this kind of stuff?" His tone carried both disbelief and judgment. "Jesus, Mom, this place isn't for people on Social Security." Maggie straightened slightly, her hand resting protectively on the cart handle. "It's for anyone who values what they eat." Tina gave a high, tinkling laugh, eyes locked on her phone. "Or people who like to pretend they can afford it." Jason stepped closer, close enough for nearby shoppers to pause. "Put that back," he said, louder now. "You don't have money, remember? Or did you forget the talk we had about budgeting?" Maggie's jaw tightened. The aisle suddenly felt much smaller. Then his voice dropped lower, but still audible to everyone in earshot. "Put that back, old witch. You don't have money." It hit like a gunshot. A woman holding a toddler at the end of the aisle froze. A young couple by the bulk bins turned to look. Lydia, the cashier working the express lane, stood halfway through scanning a bottle of olive oil and blinked toward them, startled. Maggie didn't flinch. Not visibly. She met her son's glare with a quiet that screamed dignity. "I'm keeping the salmon," she said, her voice even. Jason scoffed, shaking his head. "You're unbelievable." Without another word, Maggie turned the cart toward checkout. The wheels rolled calmly, like she hadn't just been stripped in front of strangers. At the register, Lydia offered a hesitant smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wells." "Good afternoon, Lydia. You doing okay today?" Lydia nodded, her hands now a touch more careful, reverent even as she bagged the few elegant items: tea, salmon, herbs, goat cheese, a small bouquet of sunflowers. Jason and Tina lingered just beyond the lane, arms crossed, waiting for a public collapse. Maggie reached slowly into her leather purse, unzipped the side compartment, and pulled out a sleek black debit card. Not the scuffed Visa she normally used. This one shimmered matte in the light, heavy in a way that meant something. She handed it over without looking back. Lydia's brows twitched upward, but she slid it smoothly through the terminal. Approved. No hesitation, no fuss. Jason's smirk cracked. Tina's phone lowered an inch. Maggie collected her bag and offered Lydia another nod. "Thank you, dear. You take care." Then she walked. Not rushed, not dramatic, simply with the quiet authority of a woman who had just rewritten the narrative. Behind her, Jason stared at the card machine like it had just lied to him. Maggie stepped into the afternoon sun, bag in hand, heels tapping softly across the brick path leading to her car. She placed the groceries gently in the back seat, closed the trunk, and slid behind the wheel of her 10-year-old Subaru. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat in the silence. Then, slowly, she pulled down the visor, flipped open the mirror, and looked herself dead in the eyes. She whispered, "That'll be the last time." The Subaru's engine hummed low beneath Maggie's hands as she eased onto the winding road that led out of the shopping center and into the tree-lined neighborhood streets of Asheville. Late summer sun dappled through the windshield, painting gold patches across her face and dashboard, but she barely noticed. The salmon sat quietly in the paper grocery bag beside her, like a silent witness to everything that had just happened. Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel as the car crested a hill. She didn't blast music or call anyone. She didn't blink away tears or mutter curses into the empty cabin. Maggie didn't need to. She just drove. Each bend in the road peeled back another layer of the humiliation she'd been handed, Jason's voice, sharp and smug, echoing, "Old witch, you don't have money." He'd said it so easily, so publicly, like he wasn't just shaming her finances, but erasing everything she'd ever done for him. She turned down Sycamore Lane and pulled into the gravel driveway of her craftsman-style bungalow, the one her husband Walter had helped restore board by board before cancer took him. The porch swing rocked lazily in the breeze. Maggie shut off the car, gathered her bag, and stepped out. Inside, the house welcomed her with its usual quiet. The faint ticking of the antique wall clock, the soft creak of floorboards beneath her feet. She didn't bother unpacking the groceries. Not yet. Instead, she walked straight to the roll-top desk in the study, pushed aside an old edition of Southern Living, and unlocked the bottom drawer. From within, she retrieved a silver MacBook, clean, well-kept, and rarely seen by anyone but her. The screen came alive with a soft glow. Maggie opened a secure browser window, entered the site manually, not bookmarked, and typed in a set of credentials she knew by heart. A verification prompt appeared. She reached into her wallet and pulled out a tiny black security key, plugged it into the port. Seconds later, her account loaded, and there it was, $2,840,991.44. 3 lines down, a separate trust marked Margaret Wells, Foundation Reserve. 6 figures there, too. She leaned back slowly, letting the number settle across her chest like armor. Jason didn't know. Couldn't know. It had been Clara's idea years ago, the afternoon after Walter's estate sold, when Maggie sat across from her longtime friend in that paneled office at Appalachian First Community Bank, overwhelmed and exhausted. "Don't touch a dollar until you're ready," Clara had said gently, sliding a glass of sweet tea toward her. "And don't tell a soul it even exists. Not yet. You've earned some peace before the wolves start sniffing." She'd listened. God, had that been the right call? Maggie clicked over to the activity log. No withdrawals in weeks, no unusual logins. All clean. She smiled. Just a little. Her phone buzzed from the kitchen counter. She walked over, screen still lit. Tina Wells, 4:03 p.m. Maybe skip the salmon next time. Maggie living beyond your means is a whole mood. No punctuation, no kindness, just smugness wrapped in emojis. Maggie stared at it for a long second, then quietly swiped left and deleted the thread. No reply. No reaction. She opened the fridge, slid the salmon gently onto the top shelf, and set the flowers into a small glass vase by the sink. The sun was lower now, slanting in warm orange across the kitchen tile. She poured herself a glass of water and sipped slowly, steadying her breath. Her phone buzzed again, this time a number she didn't recognize. Local area code. She let it ring out. A voicemail icon appeared. She pressed play. "Hi, Mrs. Wells. This is Reed Hall from Hall & Vickers. Clara Jennings gave me your name. She said you might be looking to make some updates to your estate documents. No rush. Just let me know if you'd like to set something up." Maggie didn't move. She stared out the window, watching a neighbor's wind chime swing gently in the breeze. The glass of water trembled slightly in her hand. Updates. Yes, it was time. Rain pattered gently against the wide front porch roof, a late summer storm drifting lazily through Asheville. Maggie stood in the foyer of her home, smoothing the sleeves of her slate gray cardigan as she watched Reed Hall step inside. He was tall, composed, with a conservative briefcase in one hand and a calm, courtroom-ready face that had seen the full range of human messes, financial and otherwise. "Thank you for coming," she said, closing the door behind him. "Clara said you don't waste time." His voice was steady, respectful. "I like that." They moved into the study, where the smell of lemon polish still lingered faintly on the antique desk. Maggie had cleared away everything but a yellow notepad and a heavy glass coaster. She poured him a glass of water, then sat across from him in the armchair Walter once used when reading the paper. Reed opened his leather folder, clicked a pen. "So," he leaned back slightly. "What prompted the call?" Maggie folded her hands in her lap. "My son humiliated me, publicly, loudly, in a grocery store aisle." Reed raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She continued, voice crisp and composed. "He told me I couldn't afford salmon, called me an old witch, in front of strangers, his wife, a young cashier." Reed set his pen down for a beat. "That's a specific kind of cruelty." Maggie nodded once. "And a familiar one. Entitled, eroding. I've overlooked it for years because he's my son. But I think I'm finally done mistaking his voice for obligation." Reed flipped to a blank page. "Let's talk about your will." "I assume Clara gave you the basics?" she asked. "She told me your husband's estate was sizable, that you've kept your assets very private, and that your son believes you're on fixed income, and that your current will names him as sole beneficiary." "It does," Maggie said quietly. "But not for long." Reed adjusted his glasses. "What do you want instead?" "I want it all redirected," she said. "Everything. To a trust. Something that benefits the community. Children's education, food security, elder literacy programs. And I want it airtight. He doesn't get a dime." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, the kind that forms after a long erosion of goodwill. "And one more thing," she added, lifting her gaze to meet his. "There was a cashier. At the grocery store. Young woman named Lydia. She stood frozen while he humiliated me. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. But her eyes told me she understood." "You want to include her?" "A stipend," Maggie said. "Annual. Quiet. Not enough to raise flags. Just gratitude. Written into the story." Reed smiled faintly, the first real emotion cracking through his courtroom armor. "I've seen a lot of estate changes triggered by betrayal. Not many led with grace." "Don't mistake me," Maggie replied. "This isn't grace. This is clarity dressed well." He began drafting, page after page, explaining as he wrote how the trust would be structured, how funds could be redirected tax-free, how it would take effect the moment the documents were notarized and filed. Maggie listened carefully, asked pointed questions, signed nothing yet. The storm deepened outside, thunder rolled in the distance. But inside the study, something quiet was rearranging itself, not loud like Jason's insults, not smug like Tina's emojis. This was different. This was legacy, choosing its own shape. When they paused for coffee, Reed looked up. "You know, this isn't just disinheritance. It's a pivot, a clean one. It sends a message without ever raising your voice." Maggie stirred cream into her mug. "Exactly." He packed up his notes, slid them back into his folder, and rose to leave. "I'll send a draft by the end of the week," he said. "Once it's notarized, there's no reversing it without your explicit consent." "Perfect," she said, walking him to the door. As Reed stepped back into the drizzle, Maggie stayed under the porch roof, arms folded. She watched the attorney drive off into the wet gray street, her reflection faint in the window beside her. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like design. And upstairs, tucked in the back of her closet behind a cedar box of old photos, sat the one envelope she hadn't opened in years. Walter's final letter, unread since the week he died. She glanced up the staircase. Maybe tonight. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary drifted lazily through the bungalow, carried on warm air from the oven and the faint hum of Ella Fitzgerald playing on vinyl. Maggie moved between the stove and the old butcher block island with the ease of memory. Red wine reduction simmering, carrots glazed, pork tenderloin resting under foil. Jason loved pork tenderloin. Tina preferred it crusted with herbs. Maggie had made it exactly right, just as she had at every holiday table for the past 20 years. The table was already set in the dining room, white linen, gold-edged plates, real silver. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just a Tuesday, which made it all the more unsettling for Jason when they walked through the front door and were met with the smell of an actual home-cooked meal and not the scent of perceived desperation. "Well, this is unexpected," Tina said, unwinding a gauzy scarf from her neck, eyes darting over the polished wood floors. Jason kissed his mother on the cheek, an automatic move, almost hollow. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," he said, but Maggie could see the relief in his shoulders. He'd expected confrontation, maybe a guilt trip, certainly not garlic confit. "I wanted to," Maggie said gently, handing them each a glass of wine. "It's been a while since we sat down for a real meal. I figured a little normalcy might be nice." They sat. Jason tucked his napkin into his lap as Tina pulled out her phone, only to catch Maggie's look. Not hostile, just expectant. Tina sighed and dropped it into her purse. The meal unfolded with smooth timing. Maggie served and smiled, refilled glasses, kept the conversation light. A story about a neighbor's new garden, a passing mention of a book she'd read twice already. Jason, for once, didn't dominate. Not at first, but by the time dessert, a lemon tart from Maggie's recipe box, had been served, his casual circling had begun. "So, how's everything financially?" he asked, voice dressed in concern, eyes gleaming with implication. "You mentioned things were tight last time." Maggie dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "Oh, I'm managing fine." Jason leaned back, wine glass in hand, his expression half rehearsed. "Because, you know, Tina and I have been thinking, with how much upkeep this place must take, and your car getting older, maybe it's time we all think long-term." Tina chimed in, as if reading from the same invisible script. "Honestly, it doesn't make sense for you to live here alone, not with the stairs and the work it needs. You could sell the house, move in with us, and just not worry about things anymore." Maggie smiled, a soft crease at the edge of her mouth. She reached for her water and took a slow sip before replying. "Well, that's generous," she said evenly. "I hadn't really thought about it." Jason's eyebrows lifted slightly, not quite surprise, not yet victory. "Just something to keep in mind," he said, trying to keep his tone breezy. "Of course," Maggie replied, rising to collect the plates. "I'll think about it." In the kitchen, with the water running low over the dishes, Maggie kept her back to them. Jason's voice drifted in from the dining room, low and satisfied. "She's coming around?" he said. Tina murmured something in agreement, then asked if Maggie had any leftover tart to take home. Maggie didn't answer right away. She was watching the glass in her hand, fog from the heat of the water. Her reflection in the window above the sink was vague and ghostly, and behind it, she could just barely make out the silhouette of Walter's old toolbox, still sitting on the shelf in the garage, untouched since the funeral. She dried her hands and turned back toward the dining room, calm and gracious as ever. "Yes, I'll box him up," she said, and in that moment, with Jason believing he had just nudged her toward surrender, Maggie felt the first ripple of satisfaction move beneath her skin. Not revenge, not yet. Just the first perfect note in the melody she was about to compose. The Appalachian First Community Bank didn't look like much, just a red brick building with faded green shutters and a single row of parking spaces out front. But inside, past the wood-paneled lobby and behind the frosted glass door marked Private Client Services, Maggie was quietly turning her world upside down. Clara Jennings greeted her with a gentle nod, motioning toward her office. "I cleared my afternoon," she said in a low voice. "We'll take our time." Maggie stepped inside, slipping off her raincoat. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, like polished wood and someone who still believed in personal touch. The blinds were drawn. No cameras pointed in. Clara locked the door behind them. "Did they buy the performance?" Clara asked, lifting an eyebrow. "They even asked for leftover tart," Maggie replied, setting her purse on the table. "Jason thinks he's steering the ship." Clara smiled grimly and slid a printed packet across the table. "Then let's make sure he's headed straight for the rocks." The transfer plan had already been drafted. Reed had worked with Clara over the weekend, precise, surgical legalese carved into airtight instruments. Maggie's existing accounts, one modest checking, one retirement savings, would be stripped and closed. Everything else, from investment dividends to property royalties, would be funneled into a fresh trust under a third-party holding name. Layered, invisible, untouchable. Clara clicked open her keyboard tray and handed over a glossy blue folder. Sign here, and here, and here. Maggie's pen moved steadily across the page. She didn't hesitate. Clara processed each transaction in real time. Fingers fast, voice soft as she confirmed the trust's name, encryption keys, cold storage backup, and final asset sweep. The balance dropped on the public checking account, $9,423.16, then 352 cents. Just enough to keep the statements alive, just enough to feed Jason's illusion. Maggie leaned back in the chair. She didn't sigh. She didn't smile. She simply blinked, once like someone adjusting to new light. "It's done," Clara said. "How traceable is the new structure?" Maggie asked. "Not unless he subpoenas 3 shell companies across state lines, and even then it'll look like a holding firm for a retired dentist." Clara sat back, her eyes sharp behind her tortoiseshell frames. "He won't find a dime unless you want him to." Maggie nodded. "Good." Clara tapped a few keys, then added, "Reed sent over confirmation that the new will is complete. Notarized. Witnessed. Filed with the county registrar." "Perfect timing," Maggie murmured. She stood and gathered her bag, but paused by the window. Outside, someone was teaching a toddler to walk, hands hovering under chubby arms as the little legs wobbled across the sidewalk. "I'd like to make a donation," she said quietly. Clara tilted her head. "To where?" "The local library, children's wing." "Anonymous?" "No." Maggie turned back toward her. "In Jason Wells' name." Clara didn't hide her surprise, just the ghost of a smile. "And how much shall Mr. Wells be donating?" Maggie opened her purse, pulled out a small envelope and handed it over. 50,000, direct gift. Let them think he had a burst of generosity. Clara nodded, sliding the envelope into a drawer. "I'll make it happen." By the time Maggie left the bank, the rain had thinned to mist. She moved through it like someone reborn, not younger, not lighter, but newly shaped. Back home, the house felt quieter, not heavy, not haunted. Still. She changed into a thick cardigan, poured herself a half glass of red wine, and sat down at her desk. Reed's email had just come in. Digital confirmation of the trust's final structure, new will attached, PDF signed and sealed. She opened the document, scrolled through the dense legal text, then stopped. Page 8, subsection 4, named non-familial beneficiaries. There it was. Lydia Carter, stipend recipient, annual, adjusted for inflation. Maggie's lips parted, not quite a smile, something deeper, something truer. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Jason. "Hey, Mom, let's talk about the house. Want to make sure you're covered before anything goes wrong. Call me?" She let the screen dim. She stared out the window, where the oak tree bent slightly in the wind, limbs creaking like old bones whispering secrets. Everything was already gone. He just didn't know it yet. Jason arrived uninvited, as he often did, with a coffee in one hand and a manila folder in the other. Tina trailed behind him in oversized sunglasses and athleisure, her smile a little too tight, like she was trying to look friendly for a photo that wasn't being taken. Maggie answered the door with a calm nod. "You're early," she said. "You're home," Jason replied, as if that somehow made it okay. They settled in the living room. Jason took his usual spot on the couch, spreading the folder out on the coffee table like a contractor about to pitch a renovation. Tina curled up in the armchair beside the window, already thumbing through a property listing on her phone. "I've been doing some digging," Jason said, flipping open the folder. "The market is hot right now, especially in this part of Asheville. You could sell the house in a week, easy. All cash offers, no inspections." Maggie folded her hands in her lap. "Is that so?" "I even found a couple of agents," he continued, tapping one of the pages. "This woman here, Caroline Jeffers, she specializes in downsizing seniors, handles everything, appraisals, staging, legal, the works." "Sounds polished," Maggie said mildly. Jason didn't hear the cool edge under her words. He was in full pitch mode now. "Look, you wouldn't even have to lift a finger. I can oversee it. I know the language. I've sold 2 condos already." "I remember," Maggie said. She didn't remind him how both those sales were forced under foreclosure threats. Tina finally chimed in, her voice sweetened with performative concern. "And it's not just about money, Maggie. It's about safety. This house is lovely, but it's old. Stairs, gutters, yard work. What if something happens? You're not 25 anymore." "No," Maggie agreed. "I'm not." Jason leaned forward. "We just want what's best for you. You deserve to relax, to not worry." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Relaxing sounds nice." Jason smiled. Tina did too. Maggie leaned forward just enough to look interested, then asked, "So how much do these listing agents usually charge? 5, 6%? "Depends," Jason said. "But I can negotiate that down. I'd take care of it, like I said." "Oh, I see." Maggie nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back to the listings in his folder. "And you'd handle the paperwork?" "Every last bit," Jason said confidently. "Honestly, we could close in 3 weeks if we start soon." Maggie stood abruptly. "Let me put on the kettle." She left the room before either of them could respond. In the kitchen, the whir of the electric kettle masked her soft chuckle. She pulled down a tin of Darjeeling and measured it out, her movements practiced, careful. The china cups clinked against the saucers like old friends exchanging secrets. From the living room, she heard Jason say, "She's close, just needs a little nudge." Tina whispered something back. Muffled, but Maggie caught the words, "Can't drag her forever." She smiled to herself. The theater of their concern would be almost touching if it weren't so transparently opportunistic. The kettle clicked. As she poured, her phone vibrated once on the counter. "Clara Jennings," she picked up. "Hi, Clara." "It's done," Clara said. "Final funding confirmation. The trust is airtight. No exposure, no loopholes. Even Reed looked impressed." Maggie stared into the steam rising from the teacup in her hand. "Good." Clara paused. "Everything okay?" Maggie's voice stayed level. "I'm playing the fool in my own house. They brought listings. He wants to handle it." "You want me to shut it down?" Clara asked, already knowing the answer. "Not yet," Maggie said softly. "Let them think they're winning." She ended the call and walked back into the living room, 2 cups of tea in hand. "I'll look at the listings this week," she said, smiling sweetly. "It's a big decision after all. I just want to be careful." Jason raised his cup in a lazy toast. "Smart," Tina said, taking a delicate sip. Maggie sat back and watched them through the thin curl of steam. The vultures didn't know the bones had already been buried. The briar and root sat nestled at the edge of town, all reclaimed wood beams and wide glass walls looking out over the Blue Ridge foothills. Inside, it smelled of citrus oil and warm bread. Quiet, expensive, unhurried. Maggie had chosen the corner table by the windows, where the light slanted in softly and the chairs were deep enough to signal permanence. Jason arrived first. He walked in with the kind of gait he reserved for unfamiliar wealth, cautious, trying not to gape. He tugged at his jacket sleeves as the host led him over, nodding at the architecture like he understood it. Tina followed a beat later, dressed like an Instagram influencer on brunch duty, already filming the entryway for her story. "Wow," Jason said, sliding into the seat across from Maggie. "Didn't expect this place." "It's one of my favorites," Maggie said smoothly, closing the leather-bound menu she had already memorized. Tina leaned in, lips pursed. "Isn't this place like a little much?" "It's lunch," Maggie replied. "We deserve a little much, don't we?" Clara arrived next, crisp in a soft gray blouse and structured slacks, her presence like iron under velvet. Reed followed last, in a navy blazer and that quietly amused expression he wore when he was anticipating good theater. Maggie had arranged the seats intentionally, Clara to her right, Reed at the head, Jason and Tina across from them, boxed in. Menus were opened, specials recited. Jason ordered Wagyu sliders and a truffle aioli starter. Tina requested a shaved beet salad, but without the cheese or anything dairy or whatever oil has saturated fat. She didn't look at the waiter. Maggie ordered a simple roast chicken and spring pea risotto. Clara asked for tea. Reed skipped the starter. Jason kept his posture loose, but his eyes scanned the wine list like he was checking for landmines. "You know, Mom," he said casually, "this place kind of highlights what we've been talking about. You shouldn't have to splurge like this. It's not sustainable." Maggie tilted her head. "You think this lunch is too much?" "I just mean," Jason said, gesturing vaguely at the panoramic windows and linen napkins, "if we're trying to stretch what's left." Tina picked up the baton. "Selling the house would free up so much breathing room. You could do this kind of thing more often. Just on your terms." Clara sipped her tea without blinking. Reed checked his watch with a flick of amusement. Maggie folded her napkin into her lap, serene as ever. "Interesting," she said. "Do you think liquidating is always the best path?" Jason blinked. "Well, I mean, yeah. When you've got aging property and not much income coming in, sure." Maggie offered him a soft smile. "You've been doing your research." "Trying to help," he said, like it hurt. The food arrived. For a few moments, the table quieted. Jason hummed approvingly over his sliders. Tina made a show of barely eating, fussing with her fork like a dancer marking steps. Clara and Reed exchanged small talk about a new development project near Hendersonville. Maggie ate slowly, unbothered. When the plates were cleared, the waiter returned with the check nestled inside a slim black book. He placed it near Jason's elbow. Jason glanced at it but didn't touch it. Then he smiled at Maggie. "Want me to get this?" She reached across him, calm as still water, and slid the checkbook toward herself. "I've got it." Jason chuckled. "Mom, come on." Maggie opened the check without a word, pulled the matte black card from her wallet, and handed it to the server with a quiet nod. Jason blinked. Tina froze mid-scroll. The waiter offered a polite, "I'll be right back," and disappeared with the card. Maggie poured herself the last of the water from the shared carafe. The light hit her wedding band and refracted across the linen tablecloth like a signal. When the card returned, approved, crisp receipt tucked inside, she thanked the waiter and signed her name in steady cursive. "Thank you all for coming," she said lightly, folding the receipt into her purse. "This was lovely." Jason didn't move at first. Then he laughed. But it was thin. "You're full of surprises lately." Maggie took her coat from the back of her chair and rose. "You haven't seen anything yet." She walked ahead of them, Reed and Clara falling in behind her like loyal sentinels. The host held the door as they stepped into the golden afternoon. Jason stood behind, frozen for a beat too long, eyes narrowing. Tina leaned in close, whispering, "She's hiding something." Jason didn't answer, but he was finally starting to believe it. It started 2 days after the restaurant lunch, when Clara was walking to her car after work and found Jason leaning casually against the hood of her Civic, arms folded like he'd been waiting too long. "Clara," he said, smiling like they were old friends. "Got a second?" Clara didn't break stride. "Not really. Busy day." "I'll walk with you," he offered, falling in step beside her like a man who thought charm was still currency. She unlocked her door. "What's this about?" Jason shrugged. "Just wondering if Mom's okay. Really okay." Clara raised a brow. "She's been doing a lot of big spending lately, lavish lunches, gifts, donations, apparently," he said, watching her reaction closely. "Seems out of character for someone who always talked about saving for emergencies." Clara kept her expression neutral, but her keys stopped halfway to the ignition. "What are you implying?" Jason leaned in, tone lowering. "Just, if there's been any account activity worth flagging, sudden withdrawals, shady transfers. I'm not asking for numbers, just a nudge, a pulse check." Clara's voice went flat. "Jason, you know I can't discuss your mother's finances." "It's for her own protection," he said quickly. "Tina and I are just trying to help." Clara's eyes hardened. "Then respect her independence and don't loiter in bank parking lots fishing for gossip." Jason laughed once, dry, bitter. "Right. Loyalty over logic." She got in and shut the door. The glass muted his next words, but she didn't need to hear them. She knew the tone, desperation dressed as concern. That night, Clara called Maggie. "He approached me." Maggie didn't sound surprised. "I expected him to push. I didn't think he'd start sniffing your trail. He's suspicious. I held my ground, but I don't think he's going to stop there." "He won't," Maggie said, "but I've prepared for this." Still, the call left her unsettled. Reed came by the next afternoon, straight from court, tie loosened but eyes sharp. Maggie poured them both coffee as he pulled a notepad from his briefcase. "You need to be ahead of him," he said. "Digital records? Yes, but also anything physical. Backup drives, original documents, personal journals. You need secure storage." "I'll take care of it," she said. And she did. That evening, Maggie pulled the cedar box from the back of her closet and moved it into the study. Beneath old photographs and Walter's letters, she placed 2 encrypted flash drives, a printed summary of her trust, and her new will, signed and sealed. Then she closed the lid and placed it in the steel fireproof safe she'd had delivered that morning, bolted directly into the floor beneath the window seat. She didn't tell anyone where the key was. The next day, Tina posted a vague status on Facebook. "Watching someone you love age alone and stubborn, it's heartbreaking. Just wish I could help more." It took less than an hour for comments to trickle in. "You're such a good DIL. Ugh, elder neglect is so real. Some people just refuse help no matter how much you care." Maggie read it once, then again. She didn't reply. She didn't share it or block it. Instead, she texted her neighbor, Evelyn, asking if she wanted to come by for coffee and lemon tart. By that evening, 3 women from the neighborhood were sitting on Maggie's porch, sipping sweet tea and shaking their heads in quiet disgust. "She posted that publicly?" one asked. Maggie just smiled faintly. "People show you who they are when they think no one's paying attention." Within a week, invitations from Tina started drying up. Then, the blow. A thick envelope arrived by courier, stamped with the seal of Buncombe County Probate Court. Jason was petitioning for temporary financial guardianship. He claimed Maggie had shown declining judgment, citing erratic spending and untraceable asset activity. He listed the luxury lunch, the anonymous donation, the paranoia of installing a safe. Maggie read the petition slowly, her hand calm on the page. At the bottom, beneath his signature, Jason had scribbled a personal note in blue ink. "You don't have to be scared, Mom. I'm trying to protect you from yourself." She sat in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, she reached for her phone and dialed Reed. "I'm ready," she said. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor wax and forgotten paper. Cold marble floors echoing beneath sensible shoes and stiff suits. Maggie's boots made no sound as she moved down the hall, flanked by Reed Hall, who carried a leather folder tucked tightly beneath his arm. Courtroom 3B, Probate and Elder Affairs. Maggie exhaled softly before stepping inside. Jason was already there, in a tailored jacket he hadn't earned, and a look on his face that blended concern with rehearsed disappointment. Tina sat behind him in the gallery, legs crossed, eyes darting across the courtroom like she might catch someone important watching. They didn't acknowledge Maggie. She didn't look their way either. Reed motioned for her to take a seat beside him at the petitioner's table, even though Jason had technically filed the petition. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with the bearing of a retired drill sergeant, entered the room briskly and sat down without small talk. "This is a petition for temporary financial guardianship over Ms. Margaret Wells, filed by her son, Mr. Jason Wells," she said, her voice sharp. "Let's begin." Jason stood and walked slowly to the front, hands folded. His voice was low and syrupy. "Your Honor, my mother has been acting erratically over the past few months. Extravagant spending, confusion over basic financial boundaries, large donations made anonymously, or worse, through names that aren't her own. She's withdrawn from family and isolated herself. My wife and I are concerned for her well-being, and we simply want to provide protection and oversight." He nodded solemnly. "It's not about money. It's about care." Maggie didn't flinch. She watched the judge's face, unreadable. The judge turned. "Ms. Wells, your response?" Reed rose slowly. "Your Honor, if I may." The judge gave a brief nod. Reed set the leather folder on the table and unfastened it with one precise motion. My client is not only in full possession of her faculties, she is financially secure, legally protected, and well within her rights to manage her own affairs. He held up a sealed envelope. Enclosed are 2 separate psychological evaluations from licensed physicians, both confirming Ms. Wells's cognitive soundness. Additionally, here is a notarized statement from her longtime bank advisor, Clara Jennings, confirming the structural integrity of her trust and the consistency of her financial patterns over the last 10 years. The judge accepted the documents, flipped through them silently. Furthermore, Reed continued, Ms. Wells has no history of medical issues affecting her judgment. She has taken deliberate steps to safeguard her estate, not to hide it, but to protect it from coercion and manipulation. He stepped back, all entirely within her legal right. The judge sat back and studied Maggie for the first time. Ms. Wells, do you feel that your son has acted in your best interests? Maggie met the judge's eyes calmly. No, Your Honor. I believe he's acting in his own. A beat of silence. Jason opened his mouth, but the judge raised a hand. I've seen enough. She set the papers down, tone clipped and final. Petition denied. No grounds for temporary guardianship. No evidence of diminished capacity. This court sees no reason to question Ms. Wells's financial autonomy. Jason's face went white. Tina let out a small gasp, loud enough to draw a glance from the bailiff. The judge continued, Mr. Wells, any further attempts to contest your mother's independence without cause may be considered harassment. I advise you to consult with your own counsel before making future claims. Bang. Gavel down. Case dismissed. The courtroom emptied fast, but Jason lingered in the aisle, fists clenched at his sides. His mouth twitched like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Tina didn't wait. She brushed past him and out the double doors without a glance back. Reed placed a steady hand on Maggie's shoulder. You okay? She exhaled slowly. Better than I thought I'd be. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. The sky over Asheville had turned that high, sharp blue that only came after a storm. Maggie turned to Reed as they reached the steps. Thank you for making it look easy. He smiled. It wasn't. You just made it look earned. They stood there for a moment, not triumphant, not gloating, just still. Behind them, Jason stepped through the courthouse doors, face flushed, tie askew, rage barely concealed beneath that old familiar mask of injured pride. Maggie didn't turn around. She walked to the curb, unlocked her car, and climbed in without looking back. Inside her glove box, the original copy of her will sat tucked behind a box of mints, untouched, unburnable, and fully bulletproof. Maggie signed her name slowly, not with hesitation, but with reverence, as if the moment itself deserved more than just a scribble. Her pen curled the final S in Wells, and when she lifted it from the page, it felt like closing a chapter she'd been rewriting line by line for months. Clara nodded. That's it, she said, flipping the document closed with the same care one might use to shut a vault. The trust is finalized. No amendments, no beneficiaries outside what's listed here, and Jason, she tapped her nail on the section title, Excluded Heirs, gets nothing. They sat in Clara's office at the bank, blinds drawn, the low hum of a desk fan slicing the silence. Sunlight filtered through slats in dusty gold stripes. Maggie tucked the pen into her purse and let her hands rest in her lap. He tried to put me in a cage, she said softly. Now I've put him outside the gates. Clara offered a small, tight smile. With barbed wire and a moat. They both chuckled, not bitterly, but with that particular relief that comes only after surviving something designed to break you. Let's talk disbursements, Clara said. Do you want the annual amount set to auto-deposit? Yes, Maggie replied, then paused, and add Lydia Carter to the schedule. A stipend, not a lump sum. Clara raised an eyebrow. The grocery store cashier? Maggie nodded. She witnessed the beginning of all this, said nothing but saw everything. That kind of quiet presence deserves to be remembered. Clara made a note. And the larger gifts? She asked. You mentioned a few. Maggie opened her planner and slid it across the desk. Tucked between 2 pressed leaves was a handwritten list. Simple, neat, purposeful. Asheville Children's Library. Meals for Seniors Initiative, Literacy Bridge Program, Mountain Valley Women's Shelter. Each donation had an amount beside it, nothing showy but deeply impactful, targeted, thoughtful, personal. "You want these in your name?" Clara asked. Maggie looked out the window. "Number, let the institutions decide what name to use. The act matters more than the credit." They finalized the entries, each one notarized and logged. And just before she stood to leave, Clara rested a hand on the final page and looked Maggie in the eye. "You've built a legacy they can't touch. Not legally, not reputationally. You've rewritten your story." "No," Maggie said. "I just stopped letting someone else write the ending." Back at home, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because Maggie had. The edges were no longer about protection. They were about purpose. She moved through the kitchen with ease, humming under her breath as she wiped down the counters. The safe in the study stayed locked, not out of fear, but because it had already done its job. Later that afternoon, Clara called again. "One last thing," she said. "Have you considered making any of this public?" Maggie hesitated. "Why would I?" "Because people in this town talk. They read social media, they watch courtroom filings, and while you've handled everything with discretion, there's still power in a little visible triumph." Maggie tilted her head. "What do you suggest?" "Appalachian Arts and Literacy Fund is hosting its annual gala in 2 weeks," Clara said. "You could attend, quietly, elegantly, with Reed on your arm, perhaps?" Maggie chuckled. "Reed doesn't own a tux. I'll make sure he finds one." There was a pause on the line, not awkward, just contemplative. Maggie looked across the room at the framed wedding photo on the bookshelf. Walter, tall and warm-eyed, holding her hand like it was made of porcelain. She thought of the aisle at the grocery store, the sting of humiliation, and the feel of her own debit card sliding across that counter like a weapon no one saw coming. She smiled. "I'll need a dress," she said. The boutique on Lexington Avenue was quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a florist, the kind of place with soft jazz and thick curtains in the dressing rooms. She tried on 6 dresses. The 7th stopped her cold. It was midnight blue, fitted at the waist, boat neckline, sleeves just past the elbow, understated but impossible to ignore. She stepped out of the dressing room, and the boutique owner gasped. "It's like it was made for you." Maggie looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look rich. She didn't look young. She looked unshakable. "I'll take it," she said. And as she turned back toward the dressing room, her phone buzzed once, a text from Jason. "You'll regret this, one way or another." Maggie locked the screen, tucked the phone into her clutch, and whispered to herself, with no one else around to hear, "Number you will." The ballroom at the Asheville Grand had been transformed, not gaudy, not garish, but quietly stunning. White linen draped over round tables set with crystal water glasses and golden cutlery. Up near the stage, a string quartet played a warm rendition of Gershwin's "Someone to Watch Over Me" as guests milled under soft chandeliers. Maggie stood just outside the ballroom doors, letting the sound settle into her bones. She wore the midnight blue dress, not flashy, but magnetic. Her silver hair swept into a low chignon, a pair of vintage sapphire earrings catching the light each time she turned her head. She looked like someone who belonged without ever asking permission. "Ready?" Clara asked beside her, her own dress a sleek charcoal silk that spoke fluent boardroom and ballroom both. Maggie nodded once. They entered together. Heads turned. It wasn't immediate. No dramatic gasp or spotlight. Just a slow shift in energy as people took her in, unsure what exactly they were reacting to, only that they couldn't look away. Near the middle of the room, Reed stood by the bar in a sharp black tux, talking to the gala chair. When he spotted them, he smiled, proud, measured, unmistakably loyal. Clara peeled off to greet donors. Maggie moved with ease, her heels soft against the carpet, her eyes scanning the room with the calm detachment of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. And then she saw them, Jason and Tina. Standing near the media wall, Tina was mid-laugh, flashing a practiced smile for a photographer who wasn't even paying attention. Her gown glittered with sequins. Her grip on Jason's arm was more about staging than affection. Jason wore another rental tux, this one tighter in the shoulders, a little too new. He spotted Maggie across the room and went still. His jaw clenched just slightly. A flicker of something, maybe confusion, maybe calculation, passed through his eyes. Tina caught sight of her too, and the smile faltered, then reshaped itself into something thin and polite. Maggie didn't stop. She passed them without a glance, just a tilt of the head, not snub, not nod. Something in between, something final. Near the front of the room, the event's MC tapped the mic. The music faded. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for the 28th Annual Appalachian Arts and Literacy Fund Gala. We're so grateful for your generosity, and tonight we are thrilled to announce a special gift. Reed stepped up beside Maggie, leaned in quietly. Now or never, she smiled. The MC gestured. Please welcome to the stage a longtime resident of Asheville, a retired educator, and someone whose quiet contributions to this community speak louder than most speeches ever could, Ms. Margaret Wells. A few scattered claps turned into full applause. Maggie walked toward the stage, heels clicking softly, posture steady. Her hand brushed lightly along the polished wood of the podium. She looked out over the room, faces turned up to her, expectant, curious. She could see Jason watching. Tina's mouth parted just slightly. I don't like long speeches, Maggie began. Her voice carried, calm, clear. I taught second grade for 32 years. I used to think the most powerful thing I could do was help a child read. But as I got older, I realized the most powerful thing was to make sure that child had a place to read, a safe space, a teacher, a meal. The room quieted more deeply. I've spent the last few years wondering what my legacy might be, she continued. And then, life gave me clarity. She didn't look at Jason. But everyone else did. This community gave me more than I could ever repay, she said. So tonight, I begin trying. She stepped slightly back, and Clara walked forward, carrying a sealed envelope. She handed it to the MC, who opened it and blinked once before reading aloud. Ms. Wells has pledged a gift of $1 million to the Children's Education Fund, with matching commitments to the Asheville Literacy Bridge Mountain Valley Women's Shelter. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. A few people stood. A reporter fumbled for their phone. Someone dropped a glass. Tina grabbed Jason's arm. He didn't move. Maggie smiled, gently, almost sadly, and stepped down from the stage. She didn't wait for the next round of applause. She walked straight toward the open doors, Reed and Clara following in her wake like shadows of resolve. Jason didn't follow, and he couldn't. Jason didn't speak to her that night. He stood stiffly near the ballroom entrance as Maggie passed, face locked somewhere between disbelief and fury. Tina whispered something sharply into his ear, but he didn't respond. His shoulders squared, his jaw clenched, and he turned toward the exit without even glancing back at the stage, the crowd, or his mother. Tina hesitated, half waiting for the photographer to swing their camera her way. When it became clear no one cared, she tugged at the hem of her sequined gown and followed Jason out the doors, heels clicking too loudly on the marble tile, her smile brittle and brief for anyone still watching. By morning, half the town had seen the footage. The local paper had posted a short clip on social media. Retired teacher donates $1 million to Literacy Fund. The caption underselling the speech but not the impact. Comments flooded in. She's always been quiet. Never knew she had that kind of money. A teacher. Imagine that. Meanwhile, her son's been trying to control her estate? Disgusting. Tina, ever reactive, began pruning her digital world before noon. Unfriended neighbors. Set her profile to private, deleted past posts, including the vague one about stubborn elders. But it was too late. Screenshots circulated in church group chats and PTA message boards. Her curated image cracked. Sympathy was hard to come by when people had already watched the receipts scroll by. That afternoon, Maggie pulled into her driveway beneath a stretch of stars, the kind of Carolina sky that felt impossibly wide. She sat in the car for a long moment, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. She wasn't tired. She was still, lighter. Inside the house, the safe stayed locked. The will stayed sealed. The dress hung carefully in the closet, and her heels were placed side by side like sentinels watching over a new chapter. The porch light was still on when her phone buzzed. A name lit up that she hadn't expected. Lydia Carter. She picked up. "Ms. Wells?" Lydia's voice was small, hesitant. I saw the video, from the gala." Maggie smiled, sitting back on the porch swing. "I'm glad you did. You didn't have to do anything for me, I only bagged groceries that day." "No," Maggie said gently. "You bore witness. That has weight." There was silence on the other end, then a soft exhale. "My mom cried when she watched it," Lydia said. "That's what standing your ground looks like. Your mother sounds wise." "She works nights cleaning the high school," Lydia replied. "She knows strength when she sees it." Maggie's throat tightened, not painfully, just honestly. "If you ever want a recommendation," she added, "or a letter of support, for anything, I'll write it." "Thank you," Lydia whispered. They hung up. Maggie stayed on the swing a while longer, the wood creaking gently beneath her as night air wrapped around her shoulders like an old quilt. The next morning, Reed stopped by with fresh croissants and a legal pad filled with crossed-out tasks. "Everything's airtight," he said, pouring coffee at her kitchen counter. "Trusts protected, assets shielded, public opinion locked down, even the courthouse clerk called to say, and I quote, 'Good for her.'" Maggie stirred cream into her mug. "He hasn't reached out." Reed shrugged. "He won't. Not yet. Pride keeps loud men quiet when the room doesn't spin for them anymore." Maggie nodded. "I'm okay with the quiet." Moments later, Clara arrived. Unannounced but not unexpected, holding a bottle of pear wine in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. "I couldn't let you sit in this kitchen without toasting," she said, setting everything down. "To surviving sons, surviving shame, and surviving long enough to write the ending your way." She poured 3 glasses. "To fireproof safes and literacy grants," Reed offered. "To old women who don't go quietly," Clara added. Maggie raised her glass. "To all the things they thought I couldn't do." They clinked and sipped and let the silence hang, not heavy, not hollow, just earned. And somewhere across town, in a condo with too much echo and not enough furniture, Jason sat alone on a couch that hadn't quite been paid off, scrolling through a town that no longer clapped for him. The knock came just after sunset, not loud, not frantic, just 3 slow raps, like someone trying to sound casual but holding their breath. Maggie glanced up from her book. She'd been rereading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, tea cooling on the side table, a blanket draped across her lap like a soft flag of peace. She opened the door to find Jason standing there. He looked smaller, not physically. He was still tall, still filled the porch with his presence, but something about his posture had sagged, like his spine had finally learned the weight of everything he'd tried to carry in denial. His shirt was wrinkled, his belt was twisted, there were half moons under his eyes, and the energy that usually danced behind his smile, sales pitch or threat, had gone dull. "Can I come in?" he asked. Maggie didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped aside. He walked in like a man touring the past. Gaze lingering on the furniture, the framed photos, the shelf of cookbooks he'd never once touched. They sat across from each other in the living room. Maggie didn't offer tea. "I didn't come here to fight," he began. "I didn't expect you to," she replied. Jason hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded printout, some kind of spreadsheet. Debt columns, credit cards, loan payments, a number circled in red. He didn't hand it to her. He just set it on the coffee table like an offering. "I'm not doing great," he said. "The market turned. Tina's brand deals dried up. We had to put the condo on forbearance. I'm a few months behind on the Lexus." Maggie said nothing. Jason exhaled sharply. "I'm not here asking for a handout. Just one loan, short term, 50,000, maybe 60. You don't even have to wire it, just a check. I can pay it back. You know I can." Maggie looked at the spreadsheet, then at her son. "You stood in a grocery store aisle," she said quietly, "and called me an old witch because I picked up fresh salmon." Jason blinked. "You mocked my clothes, my choices. You said I couldn't afford luxury. You humiliated me in front of strangers, and you did it for Tina's benefit, and maybe your own ego. That was, he started, voice brittle, a bad day. I wasn't thinking clearly. No, she said. You were thinking exactly the way you've always thought, that I was easy to shame, that my silence was approval. Jason's jaw worked as if trying to chew words he couldn't swallow. She leaned forward slightly. You came here tonight because you ran out of other options, not because you're sorry. That's not fair, isn't it? He stood suddenly, the tension in him snapping like a rubber band. You have millions you're giving to strangers. You'd rather fund a literacy program for kids you'll never meet than help your own son. I'd rather honor the people who never asked me to betray myself, she said simply. Jason's face twisted, not with rage but something sadder. A deep, bitter disbelief. You're choosing legacy over family. I'm choosing peace, she said. He opened his mouth again, but the words caught, half-formed, stalling on his tongue like they knew they'd be rejected. Then he turned and walked out. No slammed door, no final threat, just the sound of footsteps down the porch steps one after another until they faded into the quiet dark. Maggie sat back. She didn't cry, she didn't feel triumphant, but she did feel whole. The kind of wholeness that comes after finally finishing a sentence you've been too afraid to speak for decades. Later that week, Maggie drove past the elementary school on Maple Street. A new mural had gone up on the brick wall, children reading under a bright painted tree, their faces joyful, surrounded by books and butterflies. A small plaque at the bottom read, "Funded by the Margaret Wells Community Education Initiative." Across town, a food pantry announced extended hours. Staff doubled, shelves stocked. The women's shelter posted that it would finally be winter-ready this year. And in her mailbox, Maggie found a hand-drawn card in crayon, a thank-you note from Lydia's younger brother. Inside, it said, "You made my sister smile. That makes you a hero." Maggie closed the card slowly, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe it might be true. The new children's wing of the Asheville Public Library smelled of fresh paint and paperbacks. Sunlight streamed through skylights installed where the roof had once leaked, casting warm squares across soft rugs and low bookshelves lined with titles Maggie knew by heart: Charlotte's Web, The Phantom Tollbooth, Because of Winn-Dixie. A quiet hum of voices filled the space, young readers whispering, volunteers shelving returns, the faint buzz of a fish tank in the corner. Maggie stood just inside the glass doors, her hand resting on the plaque by the entrance. The Margaret Wells Literacy Wing, funded by the Margaret Wells Community Education Initiative. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just presence. Inside, a girl with purple glasses sat cross-legged beneath a window, tracing her finger under each line of a storybook as if every word might bloom in her hands. A boy nearby giggled quietly as he flipped through a book of animal facts, his feet swinging above the beanbag. Maggie moved through the room slowly, breathing it in like it was sacred. She found Lydia stalking bookmarks at the front desk, her long hair tied in a neat braid down her back. When she looked up and saw Maggie, her face softened into something too private to be called a smile, something closer to recognition. "You came," Lydia said, stepping around the counter. "I wanted to see," Maggie replied. They stood quietly for a moment, watching a toddler point at a painting of a dragon curled around a stack of books. "The stipend came through," Lydia said, voice low. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Maggie answered. "Just keep showing up, keep building." Lydia nodded. "My mom says you're what Grace looks like when it's mad enough to move." Maggie's throat caught. Again, not with pain, with awe. She squeezed Lydia's hand once, then left without waiting for more thanks. The Asheville Citizen-Times ran the story that Sunday. Retired teacher quietly funds $1.3 million in local education efforts. There was a photo of the mural outside the elementary school, and one of Maggie, older, poised, speaking softly at the gala, her hand mid-gesture. The article didn't mention Jason, but people remembered. The article was shared, clipped, reprinted in church newsletters and PTA bulletins. Former students left comments. "She taught me to read in 1987. She once lent me lunch money and told me not to tell anyone. Oops. By the end of the week, Maggie's name had become something rare in town, not just respected, trusted. Jason left town quietly. No goodbye dinner, no farewell Facebook post. A neighbor spotted the moving van early one morning, his armchair wedged sideways between two boxes marked "Office." Tina followed 3 days later, her SUV packed to the brim with handbags and ring lights. Her final Instagram story was a close-up of her fingernails, captioned, "Change is hard but necessary." She turned off comments. No one noticed, no one missed them. That Friday evening, Maggie set the table for 3. The dining room glowed in amber light from the fixture above, the same one Walter had installed after finally admitting he couldn't fix the flicker. Real linen napkins, her mother's china, a small vase of daisies from the garden. Clara arrived first, bearing a bottle of Spanish Red and a tin of lemon shortbread. "Tonight," she said, "we eat like women who never waited to be rescued." Reed followed, jacket slung over one arm, a pecan pie in the other. "Hope someone here still likes a good mess of butter and sugar." Maggie served chicken pot pie from scratch. No speeches, no toasts. Just shared food, shared glances, the kind of conversation that only comes from people who've seen each other's battlefields and chosen to stay. After dessert, as the sky turned deep violet beyond the kitchen window, Reed asked softly, "Do you regret any of it?" Maggie thought for a long moment, then said, "No, but I regret waiting so long to believe I could." Clara reached over and touched her hand. "You didn't wait," she said. "You survived until it was your turn." Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes Walter had hung decades ago. They didn't sing often, but tonight they did, one clean, silver note. Maggie sat back, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile, and let the sound carry. And somewhere far from Asheville, in a city without stars and a rented apartment filled with silence, Jason refreshed his inbox again. Still nothing. No inheritance, no apology, no more chances. The ocean didn't roar the way people described it. It breathed. Maggie stood at the ship's railing as the coastline of Charleston shrank behind her, just a scalloped line of trees and rooftops dissolving into the Atlantic haze. The wind tugged gently at her hair, salt curling into its silver strands. Below, the water lapped in rhythmic exhale, not chaos, not storm, just movement. The cruise liner was elegant but not extravagant, the kind of ship that favored quiet music and linen breakfast service over casinos and karaoke. Maggie had booked it months ago. Solo cabin, no schedule, no fanfare. Just open sea. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, linen pants, and Walter's old windbreaker, the blue one she'd nearly donated twice, but couldn't. It smelled faintly of cedar and long drives. It still made her feel anchored. She clutched a letter in her hand, unfolded and slightly crinkled from being read too many times. "Dear Ms. Wells, on behalf of the Asheville Public Library Board, the staff, and the hundreds of families touched by your generosity, thank you. The Margaret Wells Literacy Wing has already exceeded our projections. Reading levels are up. Attendance is up. Hope is up. We know you did not seek recognition, but we couldn't let your name disappear from these walls without first placing it in our hearts. With gratitude, Library Board of Trustees." She folded it slowly and tucked it into her satchel. She'd brought only a few things on board: a paperback, a journal, a photo of Walter taken in 1983 with a fishing rod in one hand and a beer in the other. She kept it tucked in the inner pocket of her bag, just close enough. The deck was quiet. Mid-morning, most passengers were at the buffet or sipping cappuccino in the observation lounge. Maggie liked this time best, when the ocean still belonged to the early risers and the ghosts they brought with them. She closed her eyes and listened. She could almost hear him. "We should have done this 20 years ago," Walter would say, his arm warm around her shoulder. "But I'm glad we made it now." She smiled, not with longing, not with grief, with acknowledgement. He was in the wind, in the sway of the water, in the courage it had taken to get here alone. Somewhere back on land, Jason would be spinning his next plan. Tina would be in someone else's Instagram story. The silence between them now was no longer a wound. It was a boundary, a decision. Maggie inhaled deeply, the brine, the breeze, the faint citrusy scent of someone's mimosa drifting up from the lower deck. And just like that, the grocery store came back. That aisle, the humiliation, the sting, and the card. That smooth, simple moment, handing it over unshaken as the world tilted in her favor and Jason had no idea. She smiled at the memory, not bitterly, not with vengeance, with pride, because the woman in that moment had already begun, already decided, already reclaimed. She looked toward the bow of the ship. Nothing but water and light. A crew member passed with a tray of tea. He offered her a cup, chamomile with honey, and she took it, grateful. Warm porcelain against her fingers. Familiar, grounding. And then she walked forward, past the chairs, past the lifeboats, to the front of the deck where the rail curved like open arms, where the wind was strongest. She tilted her chin toward the horizon. She didn't know where the ship would dock after this. Bermuda, perhaps, or somewhere quieter. Didn't matter. What mattered was that she had left, not to escape, to arrive. She took another sip of tea, let it linger, then whispered aloud, just once, to no one in particular, and to everyone she'd ever been. It turns out the richest thing I ever owned was my freedom.